You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Prologue.
Source: www.worldreport.com/science. News article title: Yeti tooth found by British scientist in Himalayas. A British zoologist claims to have discovered a tooth from a yeti while trekking in the Himalayan mountain range northwest of Kathmandu, Nepal. Professor Nikki Zipster said she was trekking near the southern slopes of Annapurna, at an elevation of about 3,000 meters, when she saw a large creature covered in dark brown fur hunched over the carcass of a dead mountain goat. Professor Zipster, who is an expert in primates and large mammals, said she thought it was a bear until it stood up on its hind legs. It was then that she saw it was shaped more like a huge human man. Professor Zipster goes on regular trekking expeditions in the Himalayan mountains but never expected to see a yeti. She said that the local Nepalese mountain guides sometimes talk about yetis, but she had long ago dismissed the stories as myth and superstition. The yeti has been the subject of a number of sightings in the past 50 years, but so far nobody has succeeded in proving the existence of the creature, which the local guides believe to be an undiscovered species of half-human, half-ape. When Professor Zipster attempted to remove her camera from her backpack, the yeti heard the rustle of her clothing and immediately began to move in the opposite direction before bounding away. She said that when she searched the area she found a yeti tooth. It is about twice the size of an adult human molar tooth, but remarkably similar in shape and color. If the tooth is indeed the tooth of a yeti, it represents the first physical evidence of the existence of the legendary creature ever discovered. Professor Zipster explained that the tooth contains genetic material that will reveal a tremendous amount of information about the animal, including how similar its DNA is to ours. Professor Zipster plans to study the tooth at Kathmandu University and present a paper on her findings at the World Primate Forum in Geneva, Switzerland next year.
Chapter 1.
Thousands of kilometers from Nepal, Kim Sun-nam, the middle-aged man who was the Grand Marshal of the North Korean Army, sat quietly in the rear seat of a military helicopter that was flying through restricted airspace in the country's north. The Grand Marshal was the highest-ranking officer in the North Korean military, second only to the Supreme Leader himself. He stared out the window at the bleak landscape that stretched away to the horizon. After a while, the helicopter began to descend over some hilly countryside. In the distance, Kim Sun-nam saw his destination, a series of low gray buildings connected by dirt roads and surrounded by a high steel fence topped with barbed wire. Soldiers armed with machine guns were stationed at regular intervals around the perimeter and also patrolled the facility using dogs that were trained to track and kill. The facility looked a lot like a prison, and Kim Sun-nam knew that, in many ways, it was. The helicopter swept low over the gray roofs and then hovered over the landing pad. As it descended to the ground, the roar of the engines was amplified by the brick walls of nearby buildings. Dust storms generated by the helicopter blades tore at the uniforms of the dozen men and 2 women who waited a safe distance away. Most of them were soldiers carrying weapons, but several were unarmed and instead held onto clipboards and paperwork. When the pilot cut the engines, the waiting soldiers hurried across the landing pad and ushered the Grand Marshal from the chopper. Kim Sun-nam paused in the doorway, then allowed himself to be guided towards the men and women waiting nearby. They bowed deferentially and then saluted the Grand Marshal. A small, narrow-shouldered man wearing round glasses and a white coat over his military uniform cleared his throat nervously. "Grand Marshal," the scientist stammered, "it is a pleasure to receive you here today, but I wasn't expecting you to visit until early next year." "I know," Kim Sun-nam grunted, "but I have become aware of some information that may require a change in our plans. I wanted to discuss it with you personally." Spouting how grateful he would be for any information that the Grand Marshal could give that would benefit the work of the facility, the scientist guided Kim Sun-nam through an open door, followed by the other scientists and armed soldiers. Once inside, Kim Sun-nam took off his heavy winter coat and gave it to the nearest set of waiting hands. As he listened to the scientist detail the recent progress and test results from the experiments, Kim thought back to his brilliant idea that had given birth to the facility. It had happened some years ago, while he was devising cunning ways to increase the military might of his army. It was no easy task because his country was relatively poor, so he didn't have very much money to spend on developing new military technology. A lot of North Korea's enemies had enormous military budgets and would spend literally billions of dollars every year on more powerful weapons. The Grand Marshal had itched to get his hands on that technology, but his spies had been unable to steal anything of use or even get a look at the designs. It had been a real pain in the backside because if the spies had done their jobs properly, North Korea's military would be able to keep up with the rapid developments coming out of the Western world. On the top of the Grand Marshal's wish list was nuclear weapons. After years of top-secret development, North Korean scientists had successfully developed a nuclear weapon. It wasn't a pretty-looking device by bomb standards, and the Grand Marshal had known that it couldn't deliver even a tenth of the kick that some of the United States' nuclear weapons could, but it was his by God. A working nuclear bomb and the capacity to build a lot more. The successful nuclear weapons program had been crucial to the Grand Marshal's plans, but he knew that it was only half of the solution. In order to develop a truly mighty military, he also needed to have an unstoppable infantry. The reason was simple. Nuclear weapons were devastating, but nobody really wanted to actually use one. A lot of people in the world thought that North Korea was crazy, but the Grand Marshal had enough marbles to know that launching a nuclear weapon against the West would be stupidity on a grand scale. The Grand Marshal knew that the key to becoming a superpower was to develop a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons and then advertise that to the world. With a pocket full of nukes, he would be a force to be reckoned with. But if he was going to really threaten his enemies, he needed to have a weapon that he wasn't afraid to use. That meant he needed a powerful, unbeatable army. The Grand Marshal had watched the United States deploy its army to places in the world that it had no right to be in, and he had wanted the ability to do the same thing. The problem was, even though his army numbered in the millions of soldiers, they didn't really pack much of a punch. They had a lot of heart but lacked the technology and hardware to challenge the might of the United States or NATO. That was why, more than 10 years ago, the Grand Marshal had set out to find a way to give the North Korean army the ability to crush its enemies, and he had sworn to continue the work for as long as it took. The lead scientist guiding the Grand Marshal around the facility was explaining the progress of various military experiments using unintelligible technobabble. The scientist was continuing his explanation. And the next batch of test subjects, he said, has been a significant improvement on the previous ones, but there are still several key elements of their physiology that we are yet to perfect. There are also a number of training issues at the moment, but you've taught them the basics, right? Kim Sun-nam interrupted, like how to talk and follow orders. Yes, that's true, the scientist replied, nodding his head vigorously. But I guess what I am trying to say is that we have a lot more work to do before they're ready to demonstrate their abilities. The Grand Marshal suddenly stopped in the middle of the hallway and fixed his threatening gaze on the scientist. The entourage of soldiers behind them paused and remained motionless. Doctor, are you telling me that the test subjects are not ready for demonstration? In your last report, you specifically stated that the test subjects were able to function at the level of an above-average high school student. That's true, the scientist stammered, but there are still several behavioral issues that we are yet to overcome. The scientist saw the Grand Marshal's angry stare harden, and he hurriedly continued. But perhaps it's best if we introduce you to the test subjects and you can judge for yourself. They continued down the corridor with the soldiers following behind in silence. Kim was particularly interested in where the scientist had obtained the genetic material that had been used in the experiments. The scientist explained that, as the zoos in North Korea did not have any African gorillas, he had been forced to send a team of operatives to Africa to obtain the necessary DNA directly from gorillas living in the jungles. As for the human DNA, the facility had tested a number of candidates who were already outstanding soldiers in excellent health before narrowing down the field to one man with ideal physical and mental qualities. Kim nodded approvingly. The group had wound its way through a series of corridors and secure checkpoints that required the scientist to swipe his security card through sensors to unlock doors and gain entry. Kim noted that the facility was in excellent condition, the guards alert and attentive. A sizable portion of his country's budget for weapons development had been poured into this facility, and he was pleased to see that it was operating at peak performance. Stopping at the end of another corridor, the scientist swiped his card through another security check and pushed the heavy steel door wide open. The sterile air of the corridors was immediately replaced with something else. Kim sniffed experimentally and caught the unmistakable odor of large animals, like the smell of captivity at a zoo. The doorway led into a large, windowless laboratory. Kim saw desks cluttered with computers and paperwork, but his attention was drawn to the two large cages in the middle of the room. Inside those cages were what Kim first took to be young human children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, but on closer inspection, he realized that they were something else entirely. Both creatures were curled up asleep on mattresses. With an expression of distaste on his face, Kim leaned close to the black cage bars and peered at one of the sleeping forms. It had 2 arms and 2 legs and the skin of a human, but its proportions were all wrong. The fingers were too big, the arms were too long, the legs were too bowed. No doubt walking and running were a problem, Kim decided. It had hands where its feet should have been and a face only a mother could love. The problem was it didn't have a mother because it was made in a test tube, Kim thought. He looked over at the sleeping form in the other cage and saw that it too looked like a creature that would have been rejected from Noah's Ark. These were some of our earlier experiments using human and monkey genes, the scientist explained. The one on the right is a human Z, a mixture of chimpanzee and human DNA. The other one is an orang-human, a mixture of orangutan and human DNA. We had to go all the way to Borneo to get that sample of genetic material. Aside from our initial problems getting the proportions of monkey and man right, these ones were born with a lot of health problems. We're just finishing up the final batch of blood tests on them and then we'll dispose of them. Kim was feeling a little queasy looking at them. How old are they? He asked. Their biological age is about 8 years, but their actual age is only about 2 years old, the scientist said. He saw Kim frown. We use special techniques to make them grow up faster. The only problem is their learning tends to lag behind their biological age. We have the same problems with the most current batch of test subjects. Kim nodded absently. He wasn't a man of high ethical standards, but even he wondered if they would all go to hell for what they were doing. But not before they built an army of super soldiers that could take over the world. He abruptly leaned back from the cages. I've seen enough of these weaklings. Show me something I can use in my army. Yes, sir, the scientist replied, beckoning the Grand Marshal to follow him across the laboratory towards a door at the far end. I think you'll find the most recent batch of test subjects far more interesting. 2 soldiers hurried forwards and held the large door open. The Grand Marshal sauntered through into the large room that lay beyond. He realized immediately that it was a gymnasium that had been converted into a laboratory, or perhaps vice versa. He couldn't be sure. It was in this room that a small number of scientists were playing God with the human genome for no greater reason than because it paid well. Kim was fine with that. He needed all the help he could get to beat the United States, and if a few laws of nature had to be broken, then so be it. Looking around, he saw computers, desks, chairs, and boxes of medical equipment such as syringes, rubber gloves, stainless steel surgical instruments, and a variety of machines that were no doubt used for genetic testing procedures. The scientists who were sitting at the computers stood up to greet the Grand Marshal, but he walked past them with barely a glance. His attention was focused on the thick glass wall that separated the front of the gymnasium from the back and stretched all the way to the roof high above. In the center of the wall there was a large iron door guarded by 2 heavily armed soldiers who saluted the Grand Marshal and then stood rigidly to attention. Kim ignored them and stared through the glass, which was very thick and lined with thin steel fibers for extra strength. It was clearly designed to be extremely tough, and when Kim saw the 3 individuals on the other side of the gymnasium, he understood why. The scientists standing behind Kim told him that they were the most recent batch of test subjects, but Kim wasn't really listening. With his nose pressed against the glass wall, he stared at the test subjects and marveled at their size and obvious power. Kim looked from one individual to the next and began to compare the details. They were all wearing plain gray t-shirts, black and green camouflage army pants, and shiny black lace-up boots that contrasted with their shiny silver hair. The gymnasium contained a variety of workout equipment including barbells, dumbbells, and weights machines. Climbing ropes and boxing bags hung from the ceiling by heavy chains. There were also a series of thick ropes hanging from the ceiling with regular knots all the way up their length, the kind of climbing apparatus one would see in a monkey enclosure at a zoo in the West. The super soldiers were using the gym equipment with practiced ease. The Grand Marshal's eyes were drawn to the individual swinging around on the ropes, effortlessly leaping from rope to rope using only the incredible strength in his arms and hands. Notice how easily he moves from one rope to another, the scientist said. This sort of strength is far beyond the ability of any Olympic athlete. The next individual was lying on the bench press, grunting and straining as he worked the heavily loaded barbell which was bending under the strain. He's currently lifting 5 times the world record for that particular exercise, the scientist explained. They can all sustain that level of stamina for long periods of time. Kim nodded and turned to the next individual who was beating the stuffing out of a red boxing bag with his bare fists. The pounding boom 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 reverberated through the chain and into the ceiling. "We have to replace the boxing bag every day," the scientist explained with an apologetic shrug. "No heavyweight boxer would stand a chance against him." "What do you call them?" asked Kim. "Gorilla cross test subjects, or GXs for short," replied the scientist. He pointed at them in turn. "Each of them is over 2 meters tall and weighs 150 kilograms. The one swinging on the ropes is GX3, the one on the bench press is GX2, and the one punishing the boxing bag is GX1. They don't know they're genetically engineered. We brainwash them into believing they're orphans." Kim's gaze never left the test subjects. "I want to meet them. Have you taught them how to speak?" "They can speak North Korean and English," replied the scientist. "Why English?" Kim asked. The scientist shrugged. "It's the international language. One day they might need to interrogate somebody who doesn't speak North Korean." The scientist issued an order to one of the soldiers standing silently at the reinforced door. The soldier swiped his security card through the slot, pushed the door open, and then proceeded into the center of the enclosure where he began issuing orders. The GXs on the bench press and boxing bag immediately stopped what they were doing and assembled in front of the soldier. Shoulders back, chins thrust out, eyes front and center and ready to receive orders. The GX that was swinging on the ropes dropped to the ground and joined his brothers. The soldier ordered the GXs to follow him and then marched across the enclosure and out the door with the 3 huge GXs in tow. He looked like a child compared to the towering bulk of the 3 individuals following him. Only when they were standing directly in front of Kim did he truly appreciate their awesome size. They looked big in the enclosure, but standing here in front of him now, they were truly enormous, but well proportioned. At first glance they looked human, and it was only when Kim examined them a little more closely that he saw the influence of the gorilla genes. The arms were about the right length, but the forearms were heavily muscled and covered in a layer of fur. The hands had 4 fingers and a thumb, but the skin around the knuckles was thickened and tough, just like gorillas that move around using their knuckles. The overall posture was perfectly upright like a man, but the legs appeared a little bowed. The necks were massively thick, just like a gorilla, and the heads were large and high at the back. If there was anything in their appearances that gave away their mixed heritage, it was the faces, which were the most obvious mixture of ape and man. Nothing petite about the faces, they were broad, hairy, and grim. Small black eyes protected by heavy brow ridges, flat noses with large flared nostrils, wide, thin-lipped mouths above granite jaws, and heavy jowls. They were faces designed in the jungles of Africa and distilled in the test tubes of this laboratory. They were the faces of warriors, perfectly suited for combat and virtually impossible to break. Looking from face to face, Kim saw that they were indeed identical. Their faces had clearly been cast in the same mold, but there was one difference in their appearances that was impossible to ignore. Their hair, or more specifically, their hairstyles. They all had shiny silver hair, including silver eyebrows, eyelashes, and stubble, but their hairstyles were entirely different. In fact, the only way to distinguish one GX from another was by the hairstyle. The scientist quietly explained, "They have silver hair because we used the genes from an adult silverback male gorilla. The silverbacks are, as you know, the alpha males of the species, and so they were perfect for our test subjects. But because we used the genetic material from the same silverback gorilla and the same human, the test subjects are all identical clones. It was very difficult at the beginning for us to distinguish between one test subject and another, so we needed to find a way to make them look different to each other. We started dressing them in different colored t-shirts, but sometimes they swapped clothes just to trick us. We tried putting tags around their wrists, but they tore them off. We decided to give them different hairstyles, and in the end we invented nicknames to match, so we call them Mohawk, Mane, and Flat Top. Mohawk was standing on the left, and as his nickname suggested, he did indeed have a fantastic vertical grill of straight silver hair that added an extra 6 inches to his height. Starting from his forehead, it fanned around the center of his head to the collar of his gray t-shirt and swayed when he moved. Mane was standing in the middle. He was the same height as Mohawk, but because his hair wasn't as high, he looked a little shorter. Mane had a mass of curly silver hair on the top of his head and an unfashionable length of straight hair extending past the collar of his t-shirt. It was the haircut of a 4-year-old boy from the country, but judging by the look of pride on his face, the guy was clearly under the impression that his hairstyle was nothing less than a lion's mane. On the right, Flat Top was sporting a regulation army haircut that was short back and sides and neat all over. Kim was only as tall as the man's chest, so he couldn't see the top of Flat Top's haircut, but he was betting it was like a bed of nails up there. He nodded approvingly. That kind of haircut was far more befitting a super soldier. As for the other two, Kim suspected they didn't know how ridiculous they were. As a connoisseur of Western culture, he could say with authority that they looked like a couple of rejects in a second-rate punk rock music video from the 80s. A lot of cruel things had been done to these men in their short lives, but nothing compared to inflicting them with those haircuts. Kim fixed his attention on Flat Top and summoned up his most commanding tone. "Do you know who I am, soldier?" Flat Top's small black eyes met Kim's gaze unflinchingly. "Yes, sir," he growled, his voice deep and gravelly. "You are the Grand Marshal of the North Korean military forces and the protector of the free people of the North Korean nation. It is your destiny to lead our forces against the enemies in the West and to rule the world." "And what are your orders?" asked Kim. "To serve you and the people of North Korea," Flat Top declared. Darn good answer, Kim thought. Despite the scientists' earlier comments that the test subjects were still in their early stages of development and had problematic behavior issues, the Grand Marshal was feeling quietly exhilarated. These genetically altered individuals had far exceeded his wildest dreams. If they were even half as smart as an ordinary human, they would be an outstanding addition to his military capability. With enough funding, this laboratory would be able to mass-produce an army of these super soldiers, and Kim truly would be in command of the world's greatest fighting force. Kim permitted himself a small smile of satisfaction. "You said there were some behavioral issues you had to solve," he prompted. "Yes," the scientist said, "they have certain, traits which are undesirable in a super soldier." Kim's eyebrows rose up slightly. "Such as?" he asked. The scientist rubbed his hand across his mouth nervously. "Well," he said carefully, "to begin with, they have an unusual liking for bananas. You could call it an addiction." Kim shrugged. "That doesn't seem so bad. What else?" he asked. "They need to sleep 12 hours a day," the scientist replied. "So what?" exclaimed Kim. "They're a bit sleepy, nothing some honest army discipline can't fix. Anything else?" "They have some intermittent anxiety-related issues," replied the scientist. "Anxiety-related issues?" asked Kim. "Like what?" The scientist paused, considering how to best frame his reply, and then said, "Perhaps it's best if I demonstrate." He looked up at the towering form of Mohawk. "Go and stand on that desk over there," he said, pointing to one of the laboratory desks. Mohawk's steady gaze faltered and his ramrod straight back lost some of its verve. "You mean that desk over there?" "That's right," the scientist said. "Just go and stand on top of the desk." Mohawk looked at the desk, then down at the scientist, then back at the desk. A look of doubt crept into his eyes. "I'm pretty heavy." "The desk might break." "It won't break," the scientist replied in a firm and patient voice. "It's a strong desk, so you want me to go and stand on it right now?" asked Mohawk. "Yes, right now," the scientist replied. The huge half-ape, half-man with the fantastic silver plume of hair approached the desk with all the wariness of a man walking towards a ticking bomb. He had the strength to pick the desk up with one hand and smash it to pieces, but his orders were to simply stand on top of it. After testing its surface with his knuckles, he moved up onto the desk and raised himself up to his full height. As the desk was about 1 meter high, Mohawk's eyes, which were now tightly squeezed shut, must have been about 3 meters off the ground. "Now open your eyes," said the scientist. Mohawk shook his head fearfully. "That's an order, soldier," the scientist barked. "Open your eyes." It was clear from the expression on the GX's face that that was the last thing in the world he wanted to do, but he nevertheless opened one eye a crack and then the other. As he looked down at the ground not so far below, his face turned very pale and he started to lose his balance. Crying out in fright, he flapped his arms in the air as though he was trying to fly before flattening himself on the desk top and holding onto its edges with a white-knuckled grip. Kim's earlier confidence in the super soldier evaporated. "You mean he's afraid of heights? Why the heck is he afraid of heights? What use is a soldier who can't even stand on top of a table?" He shook his head in disgust as 2 soldiers helped Mohawk from the desk. Then he turned his attention to the other GXs. "What about these 2? They're okay, right?" The scientist swallowed the lump in his throat and said, It's best if I demonstrate." The next in line was Maine. If he found his brother's failure on the desktop distressing, it didn't show on his expressionless face. The scientist gave him a stern order and he immediately saluted, then ran over to the desk and climbed up without hesitation. Kim breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that the GX's eyes were open and there were no indications that he was afraid of heights. Then the scientist asked his colleague to turn out the lights. Maine's stony expression wavered, and there was a noticeable tremor in his voice when he said, "You mean it's gonna be dark in here?" The scientist nodded. "Pitch black." A moment later, the fluorescent lights flicked off and the room was shrouded in darkness. Other than a slight rustling of feet on the concrete floor, silence filled the room. Kim started to wonder what this was all about, and then he heard a whimpering sound coming from the place where Maine was standing. The whimpering quickly became a sobbing and a small pleading voice repeating over and over, "Please switch the lights on, I can't stand it anymore." The lights were switched on and two soldiers led Maine away from the table. Kim rolled his eyes in disbelief. For crying out loud, he's afraid of the dark. What am I supposed to do with a soldier who's afraid of the dark? Turning to Flat Top, he looked the giant GX up and down, then pointed an accusing finger at him. "I give up. What's wrong with this one?" The scientist wiped at his sweaty brow nervously. "Well, it's best if I demonstrate." He issued an order and Flat Top jumped up onto the table. From the grin on his face, he loved the heights, and Kim remembered that it was this GX that had been swinging around on the ropes dangling from the ceiling. Next, the lights were switched off, and Flat Top passed that test with flying colors too. No problems with dark places. Then the scientist opened an empty closet and told the GX to climb inside. Flat Top's grin faded. "You mean right inside, and you're going to close the door?" The scientist issued the order again, and Flat Top had no choice but to obey. Moving to the closet, he put one foot in, like he was dipping his foot in pool water to test its temperature. Then the other foot followed, and when his bulky body was inside the closet, the scientist shut the door. But no sooner had the latch clicked into place than there came a terrified squealing from inside the closet and a terrific pounding on the door. A moment later, the hinges ripped apart, the door split into several pieces, and Flat Top stumbled out, in a cold sweat and gasping for breath. "He's claustrophobic," the scientist explained. "Any space smaller than an elevator and he freaks out." Looking glum, Flat Top moved across the laboratory and stood in silence with his brothers. The GXs stood to attention, their backs straight, their arms stiffly by their sides, their eyes fixed on a distant point. They looked like perfect soldiers, but their earlier confidence had been replaced with sad, sullen faces. They were the product of cutting-edge technology, genetically engineered machines designed and built for one purpose and supposed to be perfect. But they were flawed, and as they thought about the fact that they had failed the Grand Marshal, they felt ashamed. "These test subjects are not without value," the scientist explained. "They are in excellent physical condition and, as you have just seen, are almost unstoppable. Individually they are a big girl's blouse, but together they are an unbeatable fighting force." He looked at each of his creations. "We have come a long way since our first experiments with the human Z and the orang human. But it is true that in successive test batches, we have not been able to remove these behavioral issues. For some reason, the combination of gorilla and human DNA always produces certain aberrations. I believe I can solve the problems, but it is going to take more time. An unbeatable fighting force." Those words were music to Kim's ears. He had plenty of money and enthusiasm to pour into this project, but the one thing he didn't have was more time. He had already waited several years, and at this rate, he would be an old man before he was in command of a world-beating army, and he didn't want to be giving orders while leaning on a walking stick. What he needed was a way to speed up the process. Kim ordered the soldiers to take the GXs back to their enclosure. Mohawk, Maine, and Flat Top moved through the big steel doorway in single file. The soldiers instructed them to stop, and they stood to attention in silence. They all noticed that the soldiers had forgotten to close the door, but they had no thoughts of escape. They had spent all of their short, genetically modified lives in captivity and had been trained to follow orders. But their gorilla-enhanced hearing picked up on every word that the Grand Marshal said to the scientist, and they hadn't been ordered not to listen. Kim withdrew the newspaper article about the yeti sighting from his pocket and carefully unfolded it. "I found this on the internet recently. It's about a British scientist who found a yeti tooth in the Himalayas." The scientist looked confused. "A yeti tooth? I thought there was no such thing as a yeti," he ventured. "So did I," Kim said, "but if the yeti are real, imagine what we could do with them in a project like this." The scientist frowned. "You mean combine yeti DNA with human DNA?" Kim nodded. "It could be the answer to making perfect super soldiers. Would there be enough genetic material in a yeti tooth to use in this program?" "It would depend on the tooth," the scientist said thoughtfully, "but yes, I believe so." "Good," answered Kim. "In that case, obtaining that yeti tooth must be our top priority. I would send one of my spies, but they have failed so often in America that I've no reason to think they would succeed at this." So I intend to send your super soldiers to do it. It's a simple mission: find this Professor Nikki Zipster and take the tooth from her, and it will give you the opportunity to see how they perform in the field. The scientist bowed deferentially. An outstanding idea. Once we have created a few successful batches of Yeti cross test subjects, Kim explained, we can liquidate the GXs and direct all of our resources to creating the next generation of super soldier. Kim's gaze intensified. I want results by this time next year. The scientist bowed again and indicated that he would not fail the Grand Marshal. Inside the enclosure, Mohawk, Mane, and Flattop listened to everything their masters discussed. Though their education was limited, they understood most of the conversation, including that they were going on a mission of great importance. But there were a few words they had never heard before, and one particular phrase stuck in each of their minds. Mohawk turned his head slightly towards Flattop, and his lips hardly moved as he whispered, "What does liquidate the GXs mean?" Flattop watched the soldiers carefully, but they hadn't heard his brother's question. Shaking his head very slowly in reply, he said, "I don't know, but it can't be important or they would have told us already." Mohawk gently nodded in agreement, and his silver plume of hair waved slightly. One of the soldiers noticed, and after repeating his order to be quiet, he looked up at the giant GX and gave him a stern glare. But not too stern, because even though Mohawk was absolutely petrified of heights, he wasn't the least bit afraid of small soldiers, even if they did have guns.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.